Hey guys, Mr. Hausler. I am bored at home and I got a message from a student asking for some further explanation about this week's topic. So we finished World War One together and we talked about the treaties and you guys did cool simulations. I was screaming as usual. And we left off in a weird spot. And so for week one, I just want us to try and focus on something a little bit more low stakes. So if we mess up, during this early phase of online learning that it's nothing too crazy. All right. I know the question's confusing, but I promise you have all of the tools to figure this question out. All right. So we're focusing on the Great Depression. If you follow my cursor, and the differing new political ideologies. As always, we're going to use a spectrum to try and understand everything from far left to far right in the 1920s and 1945. Right. So that being said, what we need to understand is in the middle, right, we're going to have our basic, republics and democracies, right? And before the Great Depression, just after World War One, we're not conservative, but we're definitely a little bit more to the right in terms of letting markets run their course and the government staying out of the economy, that laissez-faire economics, right? What happens is for at least the U.S., and this is one of the answers you guys can look up, right? Is that our president, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he starts to shift politics more towards the left. All right, the Democrat, he comes up with a ton of public spending ideas called the New Deal, in which the government would fund jobs and work opportunities to help get people back working. Now, it has been up to historical interpretation to see how successful the New Deal was. And the New Deal doesn't mean it's one deal in which everything was created. It's a series of reforms and legislations and laws and bills that went into place to give people opportunities. All right. And so that's what he uses, and that's what happens, and that's his response to the Great Depression. You guys can look up more research on that before I delve into it tomorrow. All right. But we also are going to see, and you guys need to figure this out and explain it a little bit more. I'm kind of giving you the answer to an extent here, is we see parties go left and go right. We had already seen the rise of a leftist wing, right? This ultra liberal, community based, equity based, equality based movement called communism or Marxism, right, from Karl Marx. Now, we've never seen communism fully work. What we've seen is socialism trying to get to full communism. So, North Korea and the USSR and Cuba all being here. Modern China was up here in the 1960s, but it's kind of shifted a little bit more back towards the middle because full socialism hasn't totally worked. Um, Also, at this time, we're going to see the rise of the ultra conservative. Now, monarchies would probably be right where my cursor is, right? And what we're going to see is technically non hereditary leaders rise, like Hitler in his fascist Nazi party or Benito Mussolini in his fascist Italian party. All right. And these are extremely conservative, state bound groups that want you to think outside of yourself and think about, the power of Germany, the power of Italy, and the good for them. All right. Um, and so that gets kind of crazy. All right. Currently, we have swung anywhere in this green zone. Most governments are in this little green area, swinging from right to left. Okay, today. So we've seen that we've definitely gotten less extremist in recent times. Now, we already know the following. We know what communism is. You guys know what socialism is. You would certainly know what democracy is. And you guys have the concept of a republic down since at least the fifth grade, all right? So, like Andy Dwyer, you know what's going on, even if you don't know it off the top of your head right this second, all right? Now, we do need to understand what fascism is. And this might be a new word. However, you are supposed to define it right now. And it is a far right, authoritarian, ultra nationalism characterized by the following: having dictatorial power, so a dictator, right? Somebody that proclaims himself in an executive form. Maybe they step up as a president or a prime minister at first, but eventually they start calling themselves a chancellor or a kaiser or a supreme leader, right? Now, this happens on both the right and the left. However, this is definitely a central component of fascism. The next is the use of force, using your police force, your militaries to control the public and to control the media. The next is the suppression of all opposition. This is very similar to step two, but it's making sure that nobody's speaking out against your group, right? That you get to say what you want, when you want, how you want, all right? And we'll also see an increased sense of nationalism. We've seen that as a good and bad force. It's been used to help unite people so that way they can, bargain and negotiate as a collective force, but it's also been used to create arbitrary, artificial differences between people. And that's the bad kind we're seeing now. You also see an increased sense of militarism, right? Just like in World War One. And it's amazing because you would think that people would have learned that this is horrible. Now, the last time we let militarism rise, we saw the absolute anarchy in absolute destruction of World War One. And I showed you guys that pretty gruesome documentary. And I'm sure we can all agree that the people in it never wanted it, and we didn't like what we saw. So it's surprising to see the public accept or allow people to rise to power like this. And this is all runs counter to the way that politics was evolving. We had been watching politics get more and more liberal and really start to modernize and allow the power of the common person to rise, right? Seeing that most of us aren't extremely wealthy, most of us don't have a ton of resources or access to those resources. And so for the last 200 years, really, or like 100 years, we had seen politics really start falling into the hands of the everyday person. But now this is starting to run away from that idea. And if we see these in modern politics, guys, I suggest you either do one of two things: run away and create your own government, or scream no and put them down. Right? Now, for this week, in order to really understand the question, you need to do the following. You got to read the textbook stuff. It's not even the full chapter. Please sift through my website. It gives about 4 or 5 of the major reasons why the Great Depression happened. It's mostly in the context of the United States. However, it can be said for almost all of the countries involved, all right? And then you need to conduct some quick research on the differences between those leaders, right? How are Hitler and Mussolini so different from FDR and more liberal politicians of that era, all right? So you're going to have to be nerds a little bit here and conduct some research. When you try and answer this question, I want you to relax and breathe. It's okay if you don't understand it right away. I need you to hypothesize, all right? You might not be right. I will reveal the right answer, but I want to see you take a shot at this, okay? You will not look stupid. This is a time for you to try and think at a macro level, a big level, right? Think about the themes, think about common trends. I'm not asking for super, super specific stuff, but just generally how does thinking change between political leaders here? You might have to use some of your previous knowledge. I need you to take a risk, even if it means coming up short a little bit here, all right? Now, I guess a little bit more insider information as to how to answer the question. We know that nobody at this time knew how to solve the issues of the world. There was still debts that existed after World War One, in which people owed too much money, but they couldn't really make anything because they lacked resources, or their colonies were taken, or their people were hungry and upset. And so the depth of World War One didn't really help. All right, the environments of Europe were not exactly conducive to this time, and even in the U.S., we had the Dust Bowl, which upset the farming industry. We have the fields of France ruined because of World War One. We have colonies shifting. There was droughts in India, so everybody's kind of struggling at this time with environmental concerns. And then you have the financial crisis that arguably could have been caused by these two things above, in which we see the stock market crash. And that's a little bit harder, and I promise I will explain that in depth tomorrow. What we're going to see is companies losing funding and people having to lay people off. And then that leads into a trickle effect. And so people that thought they were safe from getting fired ultimately lose out because so many companies were intertwined and interdependent, right? What results is that we see panicking and joblessness and starving people, the rise of essentially bad politicians, corrupt politicians, or people that maybe didn't really have the interest of the people at hand, all right? And so what ends up happening is rather than having people work together, we have chaos for a little bit as people are trying to come up with new ideas and new funds and alternative economic plans, some of them being newer and leaning towards the left, and some of them thinking back to ideas of the Enlightenment to solve the issues. And then we see others that swing to the far right. And this is not the right of today. This is the far right of then, very different than today, in which people blame, not understandably so to an extent, the leaders of past for creating these issues. All right. However, these people on the right side here are scary, and they've created differences that would ultimately culminate into World War II, in which people would fight one another. And I don't want to keep going on to that because I should have done my original last week, and you didn't, and that's fine. But what we're ultimately going to see is a ton of fighting soon because of World War I deaths, the Great Depression, and the political ideologies of these new leaders. All right, we're starting to get into the dots of World War II. We're almost there. But I want you to really sift through the information and take a guess and try your hardest this week. All right.